I'm Mark from Rogers Memorial Library,
And I'm Becca.
and today we're going to talk about classical literature. And does anybody even read it outside of school anymore?
They do.
They do.
They do.
All right, well, let's talk about what's classical literature. I mean, when I think of classical literature, I think of only the stuff pretty much they taught me in school, stuff from like the 18th century, 19th century, Austen, Dickens, Tolstoy, stuff like that. And I don't really read that so much for fun. I mean, does anybody come into the library and check that out other than the students? I haven't seen anybody, but that's probably just me.
Well, I think it depends though, like what format you're talking about. Because I've noticed a big increase in um, gra- classical works of literature, such as Jane Eyre and Dracula and A Midsummer's Night Dream and Frankenstein, being made into graphic novels. So it's the same story and it's the same um, wording used, but it's just in a different format. And I think those circulate well. And I also think that there's a direct kind of correlation between if classics that have been made into TV shows or series and spikes in people who are intrigued into reading the classic because it was made into something. For example, the two most recent ones I can think of are Little Woman that just came out in theaters, and then also Netflix, the creators of Sherlock, just made a Dracula remake. So I wouldn't be surprised if those spiked.
Okay. Well, classical literature, I guess, why would somebody read something that's so old? When I think about it, like, okay, why do we still read Shakespeare? Is because a lot of the themes and plots are kind of universal, where people can relate to them regardless of time. But then I'm like, doesn't anybody write that nowadays? I mean, what are we writing nowadays that's going to be read in 100 years? Like, To Kill a Mockingbird, Catcher in the Rye? I mean, what fits your definition?
Well, I think probably years from now, The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas is going to be considered. Well, right now it's like one of those modern classics, but I feel like it could be people still read classics for two reasons. The first is they're really like curious about what um, life was like back then. And I think the second reason is they want to challenge themselves. They want something that's written in a different style that people don't really write in anymore. And I think um, like 100 years from now, a lot of people are 100 years from now, people are going to want to know what life was like now, so they're going to read books from today.
Well, I'm just going to be devil's advocate. They can read a nonfiction book for that.
Yeah, but they won't get that personal experience of a character going through like the struggles. They'll get information, but it won't be as personable.
So, kind of things that make it hard, because I do occasionally read the classical literature to see what it is, but the two biggest problems for me is one, the setting. It's a part of history I'm not familiar with. And I remember A Tale of Two Cities, it's during the French Revolution. If I don't know that as well, it's tough. And the language is much, I don't want to say harder, but the sentences are a lot longer, there's different vocabulary, and I just think that can turn a lot of people off these days. Sometimes it turns me off.
I mean, what does it say about people though what does it say about people's capacity for reading if like when the sentences get tough, they get going. Like in a way, I love classical. One of my favorite books is Wuthering Heights. I have like 7 copies of it. And like I like reading it because it's challenging. I like reading the classics because people don't write in that flowery um prose anymore, really. And I think like are we just are people just willing to settle for things that are easy? Do they just not want to be challenged? And why is that a trend for people?
Or how often do they want to be challenged? I
Yeah.
mean, if I read classical literature, I don't binge it, I just have it once in a while. The language is difficult, but it's like Shakespeare, like it can be tricky to figure out what's going on, but if you can figure it out, the language itself can be fun. With classical literature, I think of longer sentences for one. They kind of go on, and it can be a lot hard to follow, but if you try, then it can be kind of rewarding.
Yeah. Um, and what do you think about the role of, like, speaking of, like, getting people to read classical literature and whether they want to read it or not? Do you think that the use of social media and, like, the lists of, if you liked this book, then these are the books that 50 whatever classic books you should read before this time? Do you think social media can actually help people get more into classic?
I think social media can help with figuring out what a classic is. Because say we're during the time, suppose we had social media when Catcher in the Rye came out. The teachers that are looking for something to teach in English would probably go online to see what's coming out now or relevant that people really like. And the critics would probably say, yeah, check this out. The teachers in turn would check that out. And probably not just teachers, but they in turn would be the ones who would teach it.
Yeah.
So I would say social media definitely gets better books out there, and they may be more likely to get known. And if they're more likely to get known, then they can be shared by word of mouth and by the readers and have a bigger chance of becoming a classic.
I also think that for classics, sometimes a lot of people like classics because if they're classic, they hold a kind of universality to them, a common theme or subject matter that resonates throughout the generations and ages. And maybe some people maybe they're too young to fully understand that because a lot of the times I often hear and read about people who said, "Oh man, I had to read this classic when I was in school and it was like I hated it so much. I hated it." But then 20 years, 30 years later, I went back and read it and now it's like my favorite book. So maybe sometimes people have to age into and mature into the classics.
That's a pretty good point, because I remember I struggled with Catcher in the Rye in my freshman English class, but I read it again like a couple of years ago, and I think I want to say I pretty much understood everything that the author was going for that I couldn't get back then. But I also read Tale of Two Cities in the 8th grade, and that felt way too advanced for me at the time. Uh, I just read 1984 for the first time last year. I thought the story was a little lacking, but the world building is just kind of universal, the whole idea of surveillance. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'd probably go along with that.
Yeah, I think so too, because I also read 1984 in school, and didn't like it, and I didn't like the feel of it because it was to that style that I wasn't used to. But then when I read it again a few years ago, I enjoyed it more, and I feel like not only maybe do you need to have more life experience to understand the subject matter, but maybe you also need to be a little have some more books that you've read under your belt, so maybe your capacity to receive it will be more open to it.
Yeah, you have more experience as a reader.
Yeah,
So you picked up your own skills.
exactly.
A bit of trivia. For those who have read 1984, if you have not seen it, look up online the very first Apple computer commercial. It's based on 1984.
Oh, I didn't know
It's
that.
pretty cool. Yeah, it's based on 1984. It's directed by Ridley Scott, who did like Aliens and Gladiator. Okay.
That's cool.
But I guess, I mean, we were talking about the universality of classical literature, then they seem to just keep getting reinvented as movies and TV shows. Like Little Women just came out.
I feel like it's fifth remake.
It's not like a popular book that just came out 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, do people still like watch the movies and TVs for these older works?
I mean, even Dracula, and actually, the second season of The Haunting of Hill House is going to be based on The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is also a classic older thing. Maybe people like that. Maybe it's also not. Maybe we're focusing too much on like how the style of writing isn't used much anymore. Maybe it's just about these common themes. Maybe like a lot of our social norms and things that are typical were established in these cultures, and cultures have all their books that stem from it. So maybe without even thinking of it, we read it because we want to be plugged in and attuned to the references that are made that stem from them.
So you read a lot.
Yeah, I
You
read
read
a
a
real
lot.
lot.
Have you ever read Tolstoy?
Yeah.
Okay, how well did you understand that coming from a different culture and being, I guess, Tolstoy is translated. I don't think they were written in English.
Well,
I'm going to get called out on that probably, but.
I actually read a lot of books that are translated. I recently read Vita Nostra, which was by Sergei Marina Diachenko, and I'm actually reading a book right now that was translated from Japanese, and I'm reading another book that was translated from Iranian. Um, I think that when I was younger and I read translated books, I thought I just was like, are all books this kind of weird at first when I was younger? And then as I read like thousands and thousands and thousands more books, years later, I went back to reading translated books and I'm like, oh no, it's not that it's weird and vague. It's that people write in different ways reflective of their cultures. And sometimes that's hard to convey. I really like reading books that are translated. I feel like I get a lot out of it.
Well, there's a difference between translation modern and then translated classics.
Yeah.
So, like when you read Tolstoy, like what did you read from Tolstoy?
Anna Karenina.
Okay. Was it hard to follow?
When I was younger and I read it, yeah. And then I read it when I was older and it wasn't.
Okay. Do you remember what the differences were between when you're younger and when you're older?
I think like understanding like just the flow of the story and the motivations of characters and what he was trying to go for.
What about the language? Was that any easier or?
It was pretty much the language. This is the same experience for me in both ways. I think the experience of understanding the messages and like the things that like I was like the first time I read it when I was younger, I was like, I don't understand why is this happening? What's going on? Like why is this person like this and why is that person like that? What is the point? And then when I read it later on in life, I'm like, oh, I get that.
Okay, well, there's a point there. You and I both read stuff that we didn't quite get earlier on, probably when we were in school. And this could be a whole other topic, but should we be teaching these later on in people's lives? I mean, books that you learn in like 8th grade or 9th grade, should we be teaching those in college instead so people can further appreciate them?
Yeah, I think we should because when I was in college, I took an English. Well, I was an English major, so
Yeah,
I
me
took
too.
like all English classes. I felt like some of the books that I read in college were some of the same books that I read in high school, and felt like I was reading a completely different book the second time around. Like I was not receptive to them at all. Well, no, I've always been receptive to them. I guess I think college, the way that my classes were taught in college, I was taught how to deconstruct the books more, and I think it's all very well to like be forced to read a classical book in high school, but like you're not really given the tools to like engage with it. It's more like take a test on this,
Oh, yeah.
figure this out, do this, do some group project that you're going to be miserable about.
I still remember my test question. What do Gatsby's shirts symbolize?
Yeah, it's silly. It's like why does that matter? But then like in college they teach it in a different way. So you're more like instead of just focusing on these like inane things that you did in high school, in college it's like think about the larger context, what was going on in the author's kind of like culture during the time, um, and then you're kind of given more freedom research paper wise. Like you can focus on an aspect and like research it, and you really just get to know that part of the book that you choose to focus on. Wherein everybody's kind of focusing on the same thing in high school.
Yeah, in college, they're pushing you more to think what that means.
Yeah.
I got a little bit of like, okay, this symbolizes this, but what do you think? Because the teacher's like, this is what I think, or as
Yeah.
opposed for a test in high school. I got that sometimes, but they were pinpointing we want you to focus this part, this part, this
Yeah.
part.
I feel like in high school, everybody focuses on the same thing, takes tests on the same things, and the teacher's telling you what's important and what's not and everything. But in college, you're giving like more agency and freedom to think critically for yourself and focus on what draws you to things.
What did you read in school that you liked from like say seventh grade through senior, anything like that? Because like I loved The Hobbit. I had that read like a week before the class did. I liked Lord of the Flies. Did you read that one?
I liked Lord of the Flies.
Um,
I liked.
I did like Catcher in the Rye at the time. I remember that, even though I couldn't fully comprehend it.
I really liked actually, the thing that sticks out to me isn't actually a book. It's a play. In high school, I read A Streetcar Named Desire, and that was like really enjoyable
I mean, that's
for
a
me.
classic, but is that a modern classic? That's probably more
I
modern.
don't really know. I just that kind of stuck with me. I really liked this story. It's a really short story called The Most Dangerous Game, which is about basically this guy who hunts people. It was really good.
It sounds like an idea I've seen reiterated several times.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
pretty short, but that really stuck with me. And then there was this story that I can never remember the name of. It's about like this person's going on like a train, and there's like this cheese stuck in the train inside like a coffin, and like it smells really bad, and they think it's like a dead body or something like that. I don't know. I remember reading this short story about cheese that smelled really bad on a train in high school, and I've never forgotten it, but I can never remember what it was actually called.
If you know what she's talking about, go ahead and let us know, because I don't know anything about no cheese on a train. I mean, yeah, short stories are definitely easier to try than a whole book.
Yeah.
I mean, we kind of talked over in our Halloween video. I like H.P. Lovecraft, who's classic horror, early 20th century. The language can be harder to get through because there's a lot of vocabulary words we just don't use in conversation as much, and the sentences are longer. But it's a lot easier because it's in short story format. Then it's easier for me to pick up a short story than as novels, which can be a little tougher to get through just because of the language.
I mean, what does that say about modern? Like, when did we make this shift? I guess what I really wonder is like when we think of classic, you think of like this really overwrought use of language that's like requires more stamina to get through. And now when you think of contemporary fiction, you think of like people think of as normal books, which are just like modern. But when did that shift happen from that flowery use of language and huge sentences that can last until like you're dead to like this present? Like, was it technology? Did it change in like the 1920s, the 1930s, the 18 whatevers? Like, when do you think that change happened?
For me, just looking at us, I felt it more early as 20th century. Because The Great Gatsby is the earliest classical work I could think of where the language is pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty short book, which I guess is about 100 years old at this point in 2020. Yeah. But, you know, I read that again a couple years ago, and it reads pretty quickly and straightforward. And then you get a bit later, you got Catcher in the Rye, you get To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a thick book, but it's pretty easy to read for the most part. Then you're starting to get into more of the sci-fi classics a little bit too, like Fahrenheit 411.
51.
Okay. But that's what it kind of seemed like to me. I mean, you've read The Great Gatsby, right?
Actually, The Great Gatsby for me is just like one of those books that I can get why it's a classic. I get it because I feel like I was just thinking about that. For The Great Gatsby, it's like everybody's always like, why is a classic a classic? And you mentioned it before, universality, like just like concepts that multiple generations can understand. And I just totally get Daisy's just situation, which is like you have some guy who like meets this girl and like has this perfect vision of her, and it's just like I feel like when everybody, at least like maybe once, not everybody, that's just generalizing, but a lot of people, at least once in their lives, they meet somebody and like that person has like this really vision of them inside their heads and like you feel like you're always competing with that as yourself. There's you with all your flaws, but yet there's this person out there who has like this perfect idea of who you are. And I feel like that's what Gatsby does to Daisy. He meets her and then like he just becomes so enchanted by this idea of her, but it's like it's not really her. And then he just feels so like he feels so betrayed. And I'm like, dude, you feel betrayed by something that's by a person that really wasn't even a real person. It was just your idea of her as a person.
Well, I think it's his previous idea because they
Yeah.
had a relationship before the book
Yeah, and it's
started.
just like that person that you thought was that person's not real. That's just like the pedestal you put her on. Like, so I feel like classics can withstand the test of time when they have these themes that like you can really, even like To Kill a Mockingbird, the themes of race and equality, or even though like obviously we've made strides since some of the issues in that, but we still have issues with that. They're still relevant.
I remember, I mean, I read Jekyll and Hyde again a couple of years ago, and I remember my English teacher saying, just stirring conversation, why would somebody choose to become evil part of the time?
Very easily.
Then we got into like duality and how easy it is for some of us to do something, get away with it, and just turn into somebody else. So maybe does classical literature prompt more discussions than other books tend to? I mean, we have book discussion groups of modern books, but maybe classical literature or the things that have become, I don't want to say standard, they're more likely to prompt deeper discussions maybe than.
I wouldn't say that, cause for we like read for the evening book discussion group, we read Girls Burn Brighter by Shilpa Rao, and that's a very modern book. It just came out. It came out less than eight years ago, and it we had this really interesting discussion about it, and it really had discussions about like human trafficking and discussions about like how in the society now where we just kind of are willing to be bystanders, and how we're just, even if we see something we think is wrong, we don't really just like do anything about it. And I feel like those are topics that aren't superficial. They're still like pretty deep, and that was a really recent book.
Well, here's the question that we may not be able to answer. Despite the quality of the book, will people still be reading it in 50 years?
I think if it's the
It's a good book, but you know, what determines if somebody's still reading it 50 years later? I mean,
whether it makes the school reading list.
that's part of it. A part of what I've learned is actually adaptations.
Yes.
I mean, there are books I didn't know existed until the movie came out, like Wonder Boys by Michael Chabon, or even Sophie's Choice. I didn't know that was a book for the longest time.
Yeah, same.
So that can help with the
Choice.
longevity of a lot of these works. I mean,
Yeah.
God knows what Dracula has inspired. You
so
know,
many
things.
things.
The whole horror aspect.
And even like Sherlock. There's so many Sherlock adaptations.
Yeah.
That like so that would be an interesting study to take all the classical works that were made into adaptations the last few years and see if there's been like a spike in the amount of people who like check them out.
Probably. I'm curious what people who were fans of the book first thought about the movie adaptations, because sometimes the movies are different in their own right. Like Frankenstein's classic book, classic literature. The first movie is also classical film, but it's almost nothing like the book.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you've seen and read both, or
I took a history of horror class.
But Frankenstein gets reinvented over and over. So I would say probably the other adaptations keep the books alive, because people that may watch more movies than read books will start to become aware.
That's true. That makes sense. And I mean, how do you even define a classic?
When you touched upon universality of themes, that did remind me of something. I never read, but I saw a performance of Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew.
Oh, I love that one.
And then in the 1990s, a romantic teen comedy came out called 10 Things I
I
Hate About You. It has
I love
the
that.
whole different in the
With
setting,
Heath
set in high
Ledger.
school, but it's Shakespeare. You just take the themes, you put them in a different setting. And there was also a modern update of Emma with Gwyneth Paltrow. So they think universality means it can keep getting reinvented in different formats, but the basic themes still appeal to people. That would probably be my definition.
All right. I also think it's I mean, what's the time frame? Is it 50 years? Is it more than, can it be a classic? Can it be a classic if the author's still alive? Or is it a modern classic if it's still alive? Like, is it more than 100 years? Like, what is the time frame for it to become a classic? Also, who decides it? Is it society in general? Is it, who is the group deciding on what is a classic?
I think people just kind of, I think it is society indirectly. People decide to keep teaching it in English class. People still give it good word of mouth as time goes on. For me, a classic is probably just roughly because of where I was born. I would say 60s or earlier, and 60s even roughing it. I would say off the top of my head, the last 50 years, beyond 50 years, is I would call a classic book. But that's,
Yeah.
I mean, what would you call a classic book?
I mean, I feel maybe like there's like modern classics, which are like the more contemporary ones. And maybe things the 50 years sounds right. So I don't know. It's hard because it's like, I feel like this concept of classics is like definitely the purview of like academics and everything.
Yeah.
And so it's not like you can't, if it's hard to say if there's one right or wrong answer, because if you say one answer, there's going to be like one group of academics who are going to be like, that's blasphemy. And then if you say the other answer, there's going to be another group who are like, no, it's the other thing.
Yeah, there's probably people who don't even use the word classic. They just say it's all good.
Yeah.
It's just an older work.
Yeah. I was actually, earlier today, I posted on the American Library Association think tank that we were going to be talking about classics and if anybody still read them. And I had over 34 people respond. And they were saying that there's a lot of libraries that do like classic classic only book clubs. And that was really interesting. And then somebody just commented and said that they just came from their school for the high school, and that their high school, they have 5 kids who show up every month to read a classic, which is kind of cool to me.
Yeah, all right. So just in the sense of kind of wrapping things up, what would be some classical books you recommend? For like, I would still say people should probably, 1984 is still pretty good. Still read Frankenstein if you're looking for something a little more intellectual, because it actually isn't the pulp horror that a lot of people think it is.
It's not scary, like, at all.
Not really.
It's like 0% scary.
I would still say probably Great Gatsby still reads pretty quickly.
So good.
I know you like Wuthering Heights.
Wuthering Heights is my favorite book. Also, Jane Eyre. I don't know if Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier is a classic.
I don't know about that. I did read Jane Eyre in a Gothic novel class.
Yeah, anything Gothic is definitely. I like Dracula better than Frankenstein, so I'm always gonna say Dracula. Because I really like epistolary novels are novels that are written in letter format. So I always love like a good epistolary novel. Definitely Great Gatsby, Lord of the Flies. Oh, Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
I never read that.
It's so good. It's so good. And also if like people are like tentative about checking out like say like the whole graphic novel, a good starter is to a whole classic, a good starter is to read the graphic novel adaptation, which our library definitely has like a lot of that. Those we have like a whole series called like classic image classics, something like that. And then I've often like there's definitely lots of teens who read the graphic novel classics and found that they wanted to read the regular ones.
All right. Well, if you guys have any ideas about books people should read or what we should read, or if you even remember that short story Becca was talking about, let us know.
What is that one? That's going to drive me nuts. Yeah, let us know because we'd love to hear from you.
All right. Thanks for watching.